Under a sky so pale it looked carved from bone, a young girl learned what it meant to survive in silence. Each day began the same, the boots stomping on creaking floorboards, the bottle clinking down like a gavel, and then the belt, the switch, the hand. Her father didn't shout from drunken rage. His violence was colder than that. Precise, deliberate, the kind of cruelty that leaves not just bruises on skin but scars on a soul. And still, she stayed quiet. Because in her world, silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. The neighbors knew. The teachers knew, and yet no one came. She was a shadow, a ghost in her own life, surviving on prayers that never seemed to reach heaven. But what no one could take from her was that tiny ember she guarded deep inside, the memory of a mother's lullaby, the faint belief that kindness had to exist somewhere, even if she'd never touched it. And then it came. Not as rescue, not as some grand miracle, but in the slow creak of a wagon wheel rolling past her schoolhouse. A Sioux couple, childless, steady, their lives carried with a kind of quiet dignity, began to notice her. The woman's eyes soft as embers, the man's silence strong as stone. Each Thursday, their wagon rolled by, and in time, a hand would reach out, a cornbread loaf, a carved bird, a single glance that said, "I see you." It was enough to plant something inside her the beatings could not kill. And soon, she found herself standing at the edge of their land, a basket in her hands, and for the first time, someone asked her not to obey but to belong. From that day forward, her life stopped being just about survival. It became about transformation, about learning that not all fathers destroy, and not all silences are cruel. And that sometimes family is not the one you're born into, it's the one that sees you, broken, and still calls you whole, under the bone-white sky. Her small body cowers in the corner of a room whose only light is the harsh blaze of the morning sun slicing through the boards, forging long, trembling lines across the floor where she lies curled, breath ragged. The sting of last night's beating, still a dull ache along her spine. Each bruise a story she cannot tell, each cry a tremor swallowed in the dust and silence. Her father's name is like a scorch on her lips, and yet, even as the memory of his voice cracks open inside her, "You'll learn obedience, girl, or I'll teach you what obedience costs." She tries to breathe him away, to cage the memory behind her eyelids, but he is in the creak of the floorboards, in the dust that rises in her lungs when she inhales hope too deep, in the stick of sweat between her shoulder blades. The air is thick with the metallic scent of fear, and the walls weep old echoes of his shouts, his shifting weight on the boards above her, his boots stained by yesterday's anger. She tastes the salt of tears not yet shed, of grief unspoken. And a single sunbeam, cruel in its indifference, falls across her forehead, as if the world around her pulses with life and warmth, something she cannot claim. Her fingers curl into the rough beach-worn floorboard, the grains digging into her skin like broken promises, and she clutches to it, close-fisted and breath-held, hoping the world will not come undone further. She does not know when the blows will come again, only that they will, because disobedience is a flower he will not tolerate, and every unspoken question in her mind is a petal too many. And yet there, in the fragile space between fear and faint hope, her heart thrums tiny, persistent, as though some small spark within her refuses to extinguish. She thinks of a mother she cannot remember, save in the scent of linen and lullabies. She pretends to sew into her mind when the night is long and her body bruised. She thinks of lips that tasted of warmed milk and words like, "Sweet child." And with that memory's ghost she makes herself breathe once more, air thin and tremulous, shivering in silent defiance. The father's fury hangs around her like a storm cloud ready to break again, but in that trembling gap of silence, she holds on to the memory of mercy, faint as dust-soft light, and waits. The waiting is where the truth lives days not marked by clocks, but by the echo of his footsteps, by the way shadows move along the walls like creeping reminders of what she must not do, must not say, must not become. Her whole world has collapsed. Into this, the crackle of the wood stove, the ticking of the clock whose hands never seem to carry salvation, the rusted wire of the chicken coop outside where she's sent when he tires of looking at her. She has learned the language of silence, the posture of survival, chin tucked, eyes lowered, shoulders drawn in to make herself smaller, smaller, until she hopes even God forgets she's there. Because attention means punishment and invisibility, means reprieve. Every morning she wakes to the same prayer. Let him be gone. Let the bottle stay full. Let the rage stay sleeping behind his ribs. And still, the door always opens. The boots always stomp. The rage always arrives. He does not beat her with the frenzy of a drunkard. No, his anger is methodical, cold, like the swing of a hammer that knows only nails, a belt, a switch. Sometimes just his hand, and that's worse, somehow, the intimacy of it, the heat of skin on skin that should have meant comfort. His eyes do not plead when he's done. They are empty lakes gone dry. No apology. No explanation. Only silence and the clink of a beer bottle set down like a period at the end of another sentence. Of pain. And then she is left again, curled in the corner, counting breaths, wondering if today was the worst or if worse still waits. The neighbors know, of course. They see the bruises, the way she walks with shoulders hunched as though bracing against a blow even when no one's near. They say nothing. They look away. One woman once pressed a pear into her hand at church, whispered, "God loves you." But her voice was trembling and guilt-ridden, and she never spoke to her again. Teachers mark her absences, her flinches, her silence, but they have their own burdens. And so the world keeps turning, and the beatings go on. Yet there is something inside her that does not bend. A thread, maybe. A root. On Sundays, when he sleeps off his sins, and the house is quiet as a grave, she walks to the edge of the field behind the barn and sits beneath the cottonwood tree where the wind whispers through the leaves like voices that remember kindness. She plucks clover and imagines them tiny lanterns, holds them to her chest and wishes on each one, for escape, for safety, for someone, anyone to see her. And sometimes she imagines it, a family with eyes soft like moonlight, hands that don't strike, a voice that says, "You're safe now," even if only once. She has heard whispers in town of a couple Sioux, childless, kind, who take in strays, dogs mostly. Once, a boy who lost his parents in a fire. Their wagon passes the schoolhouse sometimes, slow, creaking, always carrying food or wood or kindness. She once caught the eye of the woman, black braids, a shawl the color of embers, and in that glance there was something strange and vast, like a sky before rain. It was gone in a blink, but the memory of it kept her warm for days. She keeps that look folded in her chest like a letter she cannot read, but knows by heart. But dreams are dangerous. Dreams are the first thing beaten out of a girl who speaks when told to be quiet, who stands when told to kneel, who says why when silence is the only safe answer. And yet, that thread inside her, thin as spider silk, stubborn as prairie grass, won't break. One morning, long before dawn, she creeps from her bed, barefoot on the cold floor, and presses her face to the window. The stars are still out, silver and sharp, and the barn casts long shadows across the land. Somewhere out there, people are waking to warm coffee and gentle hands. Somewhere out there, a girl like her is being kissed on the forehead and told she matters. The thought makes her ache, but also it makes her believe, if only for a moment, that such a life might exist. And so when her father's voice booms from the kitchen, "Girl, get in here," she does not run, does not flinch. She stands, slow, steady. Her legs tremble but hold. Her chin lifts just a little. And though her body walks toward pain again, something in her posture has shifted. She does not know it yet, but the worst is not the beatings. The worst is believing they are all she will ever know. And on this morning, beneath the bone-white sky, that belief cracks just a little. And through that crack, something precious begins to grow. Shame, when worn long enough, begins to feel like skin tight in the places where light wants to get in. Thick like armor where innocence used to breathe, and she wore it well, not by choice but by inheritance, by the hours spent sitting small at the edge of her school desk, her shoulders hunched not from cold, but from memory, her eyes downcast not out of modesty, but from the unspoken understanding that eye contact might invite. Questions she didn't know how to answer. The bruises faded, as they always did, like summer storms that leave the ground soaked and steaming, but no longer explain the thunder. Yet the silence they birthed outlived them, thick and cloying, stretched across her like a veil she could not pull back. At school, she spoke only when called on, her voice soft as moth wings, and even then, each word was filtered through fear, through the echo of her father's voice, reminding her that speaking out was rebellion, that rebellion brought pain, and pain was the only thing the world would ever give a girl who thought she had worth. She began to watch others not for joy, but for instruction, how the other girls smiled, how they laughed, how they held their pencils, or touched their hair, or looked a teacher in the eye without flinching, and she mimicked them not to belong, but to blend in, to disappear, to become so normal that no one would look twice, ask twice, care enough to peer into the cracks where her truth was bleeding quietly. She became a master of invisibility, of stitching her silence between syllables, of hiding her shaking hands under desks, of whispering, "I'm fine," with such practiced ease that even she began to believe it. And yet, the body remembers. The body keeps a different sort of diary. It's in the way her breath caught whenever someone raised their voice, even if it wasn't directed at her. In the way she flinched when a boy ran past her too quickly on the playground. In the way she stood at the edge of group activities, pretending to be uninterested rather than unwelcome, pretending that loneliness was a choice rather than a sentence. And shame, real shame, is not the result of what one has done, but what one has been made to believe they are. She believed she was unworthy of softness, that kindness was a test, that love, real love, was a thing invented in books for girls, who didn't bruise like ripe fruit at the sound of a door creaking open late at night. Her home was a place where silence was safer than dreams, and so she trained herself not to want safety, or touch, or warmth, or a voice that called her name without venom behind it. And still, in the slivers of night where her mind wandered before sleep, when the house was quiet and the moon hung low over the fields, she imagined it a world beyond the fence, where houses had laughter baked into the walls, where fathers didn't need liquor to speak gently, where mothers remembered birthdays and tied braids with ribbons, not commands. And these imagined worlds, however fleeting, left behind an ache of quiet, knowing that there must be more than this. She clung to that ache like a secret lifeline. But secrets have a way of leaking. One afternoon, while carrying firewood back from the schoolhouse pile, her teacher, a quiet man with the kind of face that looked as though he'd read more books than people, noticed her limp. He asked if she'd twisted her ankle. She said yes. He asked if it hurt. She said no. He paused, then only said, "Let me know if it gets worse." And she nodded, walking away, not because she believed he didn't care, but because she was terrified he would, because attention was dangerous. Attention might mean someone looking too closely. Attention might mean being taken away. And she had no illusions being taken away could mean worse. Could mean state homes, strangers, more. Hands that hit. At least here, the pain was predictable. At least here, the silence was familiar. So she kept walking, her shame a cloak, her silence a script she knew by heart. And still, life pressed on, as life does, indifferent and tireless. The seasons shifted. The wind grew sharp. Her shoes thinned at the soles, and her coat lost two buttons, but she said nothing, asked for nothing. She had learned early that asking invited scorn, And yet, despite her efforts to remain invisible, the world had begun to notice her in strange, quiet ways. The woman at the grocer's who slipped her an extra apple. The boy in her class who once handed her his extra sandwich and said nothing when she didn't thank him, just nodded and ate it slowly, as though tasting kindness for the first time. And then there were the Sioux. She didn't know their names. Only their presence, like a soft wind before rain, like the distant smell of wood smoke on a cold morning. They appeared in the periphery of her world, their wagon moving slowly past her schoolhouse every week, the woman with the ember-colored shawl, the man with shoulders like carved stone and eyes that seemed to see through fences. She watched them, with the quiet desperation of someone who doesn't believe in rescue but aches for it anyway. And maybe they saw her, or maybe they saw something in her that reminded them of a shadow they'd once loved. Either way, they began to nod when they passed, just nod. A small thing. But in a life stitched together with cruelty, small kindnesses were seismic. Her shame, so long a second skin, began to itch, began to peel. Not because it was gone, but because something in her had begun to believe faintly, dangerously, that she might deserve more than silence. That maybe, just maybe, her voice mattered. She began to hum softly under her breath when she walked home, began to draw tiny birds in the margins of her notebooks, began to answer the teacher in complete sentences. And still each night, the weight returned to Father's voice, the tension, the fear, but now, there was a place inside her that the beatings could not reach. A small chamber filled with stolen glances, remembered gestures, and that ache, the one that said, "You were meant for more than this." And in time, that ache would become a door. And one day, that door would open. But for now she waited. Still afraid, still hiding, still silent. But not quite invisible. Not anymore. It began, not with words, but with the sound of wheels crunching gravel, slow, deliberate, like footsteps of time itself, and though the other children barely looked up from their lunch pails and slates, she knew the sound like a heartbeat, not her own, low and steady, as familiar now as her own hush. It came every Thursday, a ritual not announced but anticipated, and when the creaking wooden wagon rounded the bend near the fence post that framed the schoolyard's eastern edge, her breath would catch in that aching space between longing and dread, a pause so full of want that it hurt more than the bruises she carried beneath her blouse. The Sioux couple rode together, always together, him holding the reins with hands worn smooth by years of work, her sitting close beside, a basket of something wrapped in linen on her lap. They never hurried. They moved like people who carried their own weather, who measured life not by the ticking of clocks, but by the rustle of wind through prairie grass and the cries of hawks overhead. The first time she saw them, truly saw them, the girl had been kneeling beside the well at the far end of the schoolhouse yard, pretending to tie her shoe but really just trying to be alone, because some days the noise of the other children scraped at her like sandpaper. She heard the wagon before she saw it, heard the slow roll and soft jingle of something metallic, bells, perhaps, or tools swaying in rhythm, and when she looked up, they were there, passing, eyes forward, heads high, like monarchs without a throne. But the woman's eyes flicked toward her for just a moment, and in that glance, there was something she hadn't known she needed, recognition. Not pity, not fear. Just a calm knowing, a silent acknowledgement that said, "I see you, all of you." It undid her. Not all at once, not with any tears or trembling, but with a slow unraveling that began in her chest and moved outward, loosening knots she didn't know she had tied inside herself. After that, she began to track the wagon's passage, marking the days by its coming, and every time, the woman glanced her way. Sometimes she smiled, not with teeth, but with eyes. Warm, slow, like sunrise on a cold field. The man rarely looked her way, but she didn't mind. He felt solid, like a tree or a mountain, the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. She began to notice things, the way their horse, a broad-chested bay with a gentle gait, never flinched when children ran nearby, the way the man always tipped his hat to the teacher, the way the woman once stepped down from the wagon to hand a jar of preserves to the school cook without saying a word. They gave without asking, watched without judging. She began to wonder about them during math drills, during silent reading. Did they live near the river, where the cottonwoods grew thick and the fish sang under ice in winter? Did they have children? Once? Did they laugh at night, telling stories by firelight, the way she used to imagine mothers and fathers might do if they were good and gentle? These thoughts were dangerous, she knew. Hope was a kind of rebellion. But they came anyway, creeping in like morning fog. One afternoon, she lingered after school, pretending to study her spelling list. The wagon passed late that day, shadows long on the ground, and this time it stopped, just for a breath. The woman looked at her, really looked, then reached into her basket and held something out. A small cloth bundle tied with twine. The girl didn't move. Couldn't. The teacher, still inside, hadn't noticed. The woman stepped down, slow, unthreatening, and crossed the small distance between them with the calm grace of someone who has never needed to raise their voice. "For you," she said. Her voice was low, even like a lullaby spoken instead. OF sung. The girl reached out with shaking hands, took the bundle. Inside, cornbread, still warm, wrapped in wax paper. A piece of dried apple. A small slip of paper that said nothing, only held the faint smell of cedar. By the time she looked up, the woman was back on the wagon, the reins in her hands. They rode on. She didn't eat the cornbread right away. She waited until night, until her father had passed out in his chair, the fire dim, the house thick with whiskey and smoke. She unwrapped it slowly, reverently, as though it might vanish if rushed. The first bite made her cry, not because it was sweet, though it was, but because it was made for her, intentionally, kindly, and for the first time in her life, she tasted what care felt like. It became a ritual. Every Thursday she lingered. And every Thursday, the woman handed her something, a piece of fruit, a scarf, once a simple carved figurine of a bird mid-flight. They never spoke more than a few words. They didn't need to. The woman's eyes spoke volumes. And in time, the girl began to change. Not on the outside, she still flinched when doors slammed. Still walked with her head down, but something inside her had begun to root, to gather strength, to prepare. She began to imagine herself riding in that wagon, not as a guest, as a daughter. She didn't know how to explain the feeling. It wasn't just longing, it was a sense of recognition, as though her soul had known them before her eyes ever did, as though the wind itself had been whispering their names long before she'd learned to hope. Then, one Thursday, the woman did not bring food. She brought an invitation. "If you ever need a place," she said, "come to the house by the river. We'll leave the lamp lit." That was all. No pressure. No promise. Just an opening, a lifeline, a door cracked ever so slightly. That night, the girl couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind press against the walls, wondering if it carried the scent of cedar and river reeds, wondering if she would ever be brave enough to walk away from the only pain she'd ever known toward a kindness she'd only dared to taste. But something in her was waking, rising, like a prairie fire, slow and unstoppable. She didn't run that night. Not the next, either. But she began to prepare, quietly, carefully, folding hope like linens in her chest, saving scraps, watching the moon's path. And though the house still echoed with her father's fury, she no longer belonged entirely to it. Because now there was another world waiting down by the river, where the lamp would be lit, and a woman with ember eyes would be waiting with warm hands and a voice like forgiveness. And though the girl didn't know it yet, she had already Started walking toward that light dot. It happened on a Monday, though the day itself felt unremarkable. Gray skies stretching low over the fields, the wind sharp enough to chap the lips. A kind of morning where even the roosters sounded tired, and she was walking home the long way, down past the willow grove near the creek bed. Not because she liked the extra mile, but because it gave her 10 more minutes away from the house. 10 more minutes where her breath didn't catch at every sudden noise, where she could pretend, just for a little while, that she was only a girl with a book bag and not a prisoner with invisible chains. And it was there, where the frost still clung to the shadowed edges of fallen leaves, that she saw the woman standing by the fence, the same woman whose ember shawl had become more familiar to her than the sunrise, whose hands had offered more quiet hope than any preacher's sermon. She didn't startle, though she should have. Strangers didn't appear in her path, especially not ones who smiled so gently and waited as though time itself could be paused for a single trembling child. The woman held a basket, not outstretched but close to her chest, as if the offer it contained was not food this time, but something weightier, an invitation, a question, a beginning. "Do you like chickens?" the woman asked, her voice carrying no urgency, no expectation, just a soft curiosity that felt like the first warm breeze after a long winter. The girl blinked. It had been weeks since anyone had asked her a question. That wasn't a demand or a threat. "They're fine," she said quietly, unsure if the answer was correct, if there even was a correct answer. The woman smiled wider and with a small motion of her chin, gestured toward the nearby trees where a modest coop stood, half hidden beneath branches still bare from the cold. "We could use a hand gathering eggs," she said. "And the hens." Like soft voices, the girl didn't know why her feet moved. She didn't decide, they just did. Like something in her had already chosen before her mind could catch up. Like her body recognized sanctuary before her heart dared name it. The basket was handed to her, light in weight but heavy in meaning, and together they walked the short path to the coop, where the cluck and shuffle of feathers welcomed them like old friends. Inside, it smelled of straw and cedar shavings, and something else, something warm, alive, like home might smell if it had ever been safe. The woman knelt, showed her how to reach beneath without startling the hens, how to use a sing-song hum to keep them calm, and the girl mirrored her, awkward at first. But soon her fingers found rhythm, and the eggs nestled into the basket like small white promises. They didn't speak much. There was no need. The air between them said what words couldn't. "I see your pain. I won't rush you. You are safe here, even if only for a little while." When the chore was done, the woman offered her a small piece of honeycomb from her pocket. "For sweet teeth," she said, and the girl took it, biting into it with reverence, the golden syrup clinging to her tongue in a way that felt almost holy. She didn't go home right away. She lingered, sitting on a stump while the woman tended to the goats, watching as the man, her husband, she assumed, carved wood beneath the porch, his hands steady and sure. No one asked her questions. No one told her she was in the way. She just was, present, unharmed, unbothered. It felt strange. At first, like wearing shoes too soft after years of walking barefoot on gravel. But she didn't resist it. She simply sat, breathed, watched. When the woman finally walked her to the edge of the property, she said only, "You're welcome back. Anytime," and that was that. No promises, no pressure. Just the kind of door that stays cracked, waiting for someone brave enough to step through. She did go back. Not every day. Not in any pattern, but enough. Enough to learn the names of the hens and the songs the woman hummed while hanging laundry. Enough to learn that the man carved birds because they reminded him of someone he lost, and that the woman lit a candle each morning, not for ceremony, but remembrance. Enough to realize that silence in their home didn't mean danger, it meant peace. She never told them about her father, not directly. But they saw the way she flinched at loud noises, The way she hesitated before accepting food. The way she tensed when the man walked too close. They never asked. They simply gave her space, gave her tasks, gave her moments where she could be useful without being used. Slowly, she began to shed pieces of fear, not all at once, but in slivers, like bark peeling from a tree in spring. She laughed once, softly, when a goat nibbled her hair, and the sound startled her. She hadn't heard her own laughter in so long, it felt foreign. The woman smiled, but didn't comment. Just handed her a cup of tea and let the moment settle. One afternoon, while mending a tear in a feed sack, the woman said, "You remind me of a river stone." The girl looked up, confused. "Hard?" she asked. "No," the woman said. "Strong, but shaped by what's passed over you. Still. Beautiful." The words lodged in her chest like a seed waiting for spring. She carried them home that night, repeated them silently as she climbed the porch steps, as she endured her father's grunted curses, as she slipped into bed and clutched her threadbare blanket to her chin. She wasn't healed, not yet, but something had begun. Something slow and irreversible. She began to look forward to Mondays. Not because the beatings stopped, they didn't, but because there was now a light beyond them. A place where her hands were useful, her silence respected, her presence valued. She began to leave small things behind at their place. A button she found, a feather, a drawing of a hawk she saw on the way there. Not gifts exactly, just offerings. Proof that she was beginning to see herself as someone who had something to give. One evening, the man carved her name into a piece of pine, just her first name, smooth and even. He handed it to her without ceremony. She held it like a relic. Her name, made permanent by hands that never struck. It was the first time her name hadn't felt like a summons to pain. It felt like identity, like belonging. And though she still returned home each night, still endured the same hollow rages, her heart no longer lived there entirely. A piece of it had moved, had rooted itself in softer soil. And one day soon, that piece would grow strong enough to pull the rest of her with it. But for now, she kept walking that path. Kept collecting eggs. Kept listening to the wind and wondering if perhaps it was whispering that she was already halfway free. The day the truth began to unwind itself was the day she didn't expect to survive, not because the pain was new, but because this time it came wrapped in silence, in a kind of stormless violence that felt heavier than fists and left no visible bruises. Just a cold, echoing vacancy where her hope had been growing. She had returned late from the Sioux couple's home, later than usual. The sky already bruised with dusk, and though she had tiptoed like always, pressing her weight to the outer floorboards, easing the door open like a ghost, her father had been waiting, his silhouette rigid in the chair, a half-drunk bottle glinting beside him like a snake coiled to strike. He didn't speak at first, just watched her with eyes that didn't burn like they used to but stared through her, as if she were already gone, already lost. She froze, braced. "You think they'll keep you?" he said finally, his voice low, without edge but soaked in something darker regret. Maybe resentment. "You think they know who you are?" She said nothing. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, not in defiance but to keep from shaking. He stood. The chair scraped the floor like a warning bell. "That woman," he said, stepping closer. "She's got eyes too kind. She doesn't know what you are. Doesn't know what I did to make you this way." Her breath hitched. What he did. It was the first time ever that he said it like that, not as punishment, not as discipline, but as confession. And suddenly, she saw at his shoulders slumped not from anger but weight. His breath sour not just from liquor, but from something festering inside him for years. "You think I liked it?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "Think I wanted to raise a girl after your mama died? She bled out in that bed trying to bring you here. I looked at you and saw her death." The words fell like stones. She staggered beneath them. "And I hated you. he whispered. I hated you for taking her from me. Every bruise, every word, I told myself you deserved it. That I was just trying to beat the sin out of you. But truth is, he swallowed hard. I didn't know what else to do with the guilt. The world spun, the room tilted. She backed. Against the wall, not in fear this time, but in disbelief. Because the monster who had ruled her world with belt and boot was unraveling before her, not shouting, not swinging, but breaking. The couple, he said, sitting down heavily. They came to me a year ago. Asked if I knew anyone with a child who needed a home. I laughed in their faces. Said no one gives away blood. But they gave me something. Wood, supplies, help when the storm knocked the fence down. They just kept coming. Didn't ask for anything. And last winter, when that Sioux boy got sick, I gave them the deed to the back acre. Sold it for less than its worth. Paid the doctor's travel. She stared at him. Words didn't form. I thought maybe if I helped them, the guilt would go away. If I gave enough, maybe God would stop punishing me through you. His voice cracked on the last word, and she saw it, truly saw it, the brokenness, not as excuse, not as redemption, but as explanation. He hadn't been strong. He hadn't been cruel for the sake of cruelty. He had been drowning, and in his flailing, he'd pulled her under too. I know you go there, he added. I've seen you. I don't stop you. Figured you'd go sooner. Or later. Then he looked up, eyes red-rimmed, and for the first time in her life she didn't see rage. She saw regret. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I wouldn't, but I want you to know what I did to you, what I was. It wasn't about you. You were just the only thing left I could control. And in that moment, something in her cracked, not forgiveness, not yet, but the solid wall of hatred she'd built to protect herself. Because now, she saw not a demon, but a man small, ashamed, haunted. A man who had failed spectacularly at love, but who had, in his twisted, broken way, tried to trade pain for redemption. Her throat closed. She turned and left, footsteps. Quiet but no longer hiding. She walked to the field, let the wind tear through her hair, stared up at the sky. It was purple now, the stars like pinpricks of truth. She didn't cry, not yet. There would be time for that. But she felt something shift, a rebalancing, a loosening. She had always believed she was born into suffering, that her father's rage was her inheritance. But now she knew he was just a man. And that meant his story didn't have to be hers. She walked until the river whispered at her feet. The lamp was lit in the window of the Sioux couple's home, waiting, as promised. And though she stood there a long time, staring, breathing, remembering, she did not knock. Not yet. Instead, she sat by the water, let the sounds of the night gather around her, and held the truth in her hands like something fragile. Her father had sold land to save another child, had allowed her to drift toward kindness without yanking her back, had confessed too late maybe, but confessed all the same. That night, as she drifted to sleep beneath the stars, the girl didn't feel saved. But she did feel seen. And that was a beginning. In the weeks that followed her father's confession, the world around her didn't change, not in the way people expect when stories hit turning points. Not with golden light or grand forgiveness or the sudden disappearance of fear. But inside her, something fundamental had shifted, and that change, though quiet, was irreversible. Like the first trickle of water beneath ice in spring, a slow thawing that promised rivers in time. She still woke with the same guarded breath, still flinched at sudden noises, still kept her shoes by the door in case she needed to flee, but her heart no longer beat entirely under the rule of fear. Instead, it had started to divide its loyalty, threading itself cautiously between two legacies, one of blood and violence, and one of mercy and silence. And in that delicate weaving, she began to understand that not all fathers are born of Blood, and not all damage is intended, and not all healing comes from apologies. Her birth father remained in the house, his days slower now, more subdued, his rages muted into long silences, and the occasional muttered prayer at the window. He didn't touch her anymore, didn't speak much, but his presence remained like smoke after fire, clinging to everything. Yet in the absence of fresh wounds, she could finally examine the old ones, and in doing so, she saw more than the violence, she saw the grief beneath it. The smallness of a man who never learned how to carry love, who held pain in his fists, because he never had the words to hold it anywhere else. But seeing that didn't make it easier to stay. It made it easier to leave, because now she could name what had happened. And once you name a cage, the lock begins to rust. Meanwhile, on the river's edge, the Sioux couple's home became less a refuge and more a mirror reflecting not who she had been, but who she might become. The man, quiet as ever, never spoke of her father, never asked questions, never pressed, but he gave her things her father never had: space, steadiness, silence without threat. He handed her tools without instruction, trusting she'd learn. He let her mend fence posts beside him, their labor shared and wordless, and in those long afternoons beneath the low-hanging sky, with the scent of cedar and dust in the air, she began to understand what strength could look like without anger, how a man could be firm without cruelty, silent without being cold, powerful without making others small. One day, she dropped a bucket of nails by accident, the clang breaking the calm like a shot, and she froze, breath held, waiting for the reprimand, the curse, the slap she had known would come. But instead, the man only looked up, blinked once, then said gently, "They're not going anywhere. We've got time." She stared at him, disoriented by the absence of punishment, and in that moment, she realized that kindness wasn't always loud. It could live in the pauses, in the grace of letting a mistake be only a mistake. The woman, for her part, continued to nurture in ways that didn't announce themselves as nurturing. She never tried to mother her, never asked her to explain her tears, never tried to fill the holes others had left. Instead, she fed her consistently, without question. She taught her how to stitch leather, how to dry herbs for winter, how to listen for weather in the trees. These small teachings became the backbone of trust, and with each one, the girl shed more of her shame. It was during one of those lessons, pressing lavender into cloth, that the woman finally spoke of children. "We had one once," she said, softly. "A son, didn't make it past 3 winters." She didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The grief sat between them, real and sacred, and in that shared silence, the girl understood that love and loss are woven from the same threads. Over time, the girl began to imagine what it would mean to stay, not just visit, not just linger, but belong. She imagined her boots by their door, her hands planting seeds in their garden come spring, her name written not in pine carvings, but in the rhythms of daily life. Yet she hesitated, because to stay meant leaving behind something, not just a house or a name, but a history, a father. And no matter how cruel he had been, no matter how much of her childhood he had burned, part of her still held a thread to him. The thread of blood, of memory, of a man once young and broken, who had tried, in the end, to give what little good he had left to a stranger's child. That duality haunted her. 2 fathers. One who gave her life and pain. One who gave her silence and space. One who showed her the cost of unspoken grief. One who showed her the gift of patient presence. She didn't know how to carry both truths, didn't know if she had to choose, but she did know that both had shaped her, that she was not made of one man's rage, nor only of another's mercy, but of the spaces between them, the choices she made in spite of them. And perhaps, she thought, that was the legacy worth keeping, not the blood, not the scars, but the becoming. The slow, deliberate shaping of self from ruin. One evening, while shelling peas by the porch, she asked the man, How do you forgive? Someone who never knew how to love you. He didn't look up. Just said, by learning to love yourself louder than they ever could. She held that sentence in her mouth like medicine bitter, slow to dissolve, but healing all the same. That night, she wrote her name in the dirt beside the river and watched the water take it. Watched it drift into the current like a promise. I will not be what was done to me. She still visited her father, brought him bread sometimes, sat with him in silence. He never asked her to stay. Never said he was sorry again. But once, as she stood to leave, he reached out not to grab, not to hold, just to touch her sleeve. You're more like your mother than I deserved, he whispered. She didn't cry, but she didn't pull away either. And when she walked back to the river house, she felt lighter. She didn't belong to either man. But from both, she had learned what kind of person she would never be, and what kind she might one day become. And that, in the end, was enough. Healing does not announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in like dawn through a cracked shutter, unnoticed at first. Until suddenly the room is filled with light you didn't realize you missed, and that's how it was for her. This girl once forged in fear, now beginning to root herself in the quiet corners of a home that held no locks, no raised voices. No looming shadows, only the slow, rhythmic unfolding of days where her value was measured not in obedience but in presence, where her silences weren't interrogated but respected, and the very ground she walked on seemed to rise up gently to meet her bare feet instead of punishing them for treading too softly. In the mornings, the rooster crowed not as a warning but as a welcome, and she rose with the sun, her hands no longer trembling, but reaching for the basin of water where she washed her face, for the linen she folded into clean squares, for the small wooden comb the woman had carved for her, each tooth rounded smooth by care and time. The kitchen smelled always of something earthy and warm, simmering beans, ash, herbs, smoke, and the woman moved through it like an old song. Soft and sure, her gestures speaking more clearly than words. Here, this is how you stir stew with your whole arm. Here, this is where we keep the honey for wounds in winter. And slowly she learned, not just how to prepare food or mend cloth, but how to exist without apology. She learned the language of the wind as it sifted through the river reeds, learned the names of birds by their shadows, learned how to sit with her hands still and not be punished for idleness. She even began to sing not loudly, not for others, but under her breath as she gathered eggs or swept the porch, little humming melodies stitched together from memory and instinct, each note a tender rebellion against the silence that had once swallowed her whole. The man taught her things too, not through instruction, but presence. He showed her how to check fence posts for rot, how to listen for the change in a goat's bleat that meant trouble, how to tell a story without words. Just the slow carving of a figure from wood, and the way his eyes softened when he finished. One evening, as the moon lifted fat and golden over the river, he handed her a carving, a bird in flight, wings wide, beak open in song. This one's for you, he said simply, and she held it like a heart. These quiet offerings of tools, of trust, of space, became her soil, and from them she began to grow. First inwardly, a deepening of roots, then outwardly, her voice firmer, her eyes meeting others without flinching. She asked questions now. She laughed once, openly, when a goat tried to eat her skirt. She didn't just walk into rooms, she entered them. Present, alive. One day, she found a bundle of her old clothes, stiff, threadbare, stained, and without ceremony. She buried them beneath the cottonwood tree near the coop, pressing them into the earth like a grave for a life she no longer lived. And in their place, she wore garments the woman had sewn for her, soft linen, dyed with berries, stitched with quiet care. When she walked to town, heads turned, not because she was beautiful, though she was becoming that in her own way, but because she was upright. Her shoulders no longer curled inward, her steps even and measured, as if she had finally grown into the shape of her own name, some noticed. Whispers rose. That's the Harlan girl. Thought she was gone, thought she was touched in the head. But she didn't flinch, didn't hurry. She had stopped shrinking to fit the stories others wrote for her. She wasn't trying to be invisible anymore. She was learning to exist as herself whole, seen, unashamed. At night, beneath the stars, she would lie in the grass behind the house, the river murmuring close by, and she would speak to the sky, not prayers, not questions, just words, thoughts, truths. I made it through. I am still here. I want more. The land listened, the wind too. And in their listening, she felt validated, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a person, a young woman whose life, however broken it began, was now being mended by choice, by patience, by love that asked nothing and gave everything. One morning, the woman handed her a mirror, not new, not polished, but clean, and said, "See what we see." She looked, really looked. And what she saw wasn't just the healing, the fading bruises, the growing hair, the steadier gaze, but the fire inside, the one no one had managed to beat out of her. It flickered in her eyes, subtle but unyielding, and she smiled. The kind of smile born not of happiness but of deep recognition. She was no longer the girl who flinched. She was the girl who stayed, who chose to stay, who planted herself in quiet corners and bloomed like wildflower through cracked stone. And she knew it with the certainty of sun and soil that, no matter what came next, she would not be lost again, because she had found something unshakable, something no one could take, herself. She had not planned it, not circled the date, not marked it with a stone on the windowsill or whispered it into the firelight. But one morning, as the river hummed low and steady beside the house, and the smell of early spring floated through the cotton trees, she stood from the porch where she'd been braiding twine and said, softly but without tremble, "I need to go back." And the woman, who had long since learned that healing does not always move forward in straight lines, only nodded, packed her a small satchel of bread and water, and placed a strand of dried sage inside, not as a charm, not as a superstition, but as a remembrance that what we carry in our hands should echo what we carry in our hearts. She walked, alone. She didn't want a wagon, didn't want footsteps beside her. This was a pilgrimage meant for one, a quiet reckoning with the soil and shadows of her former life. The path, though long, felt different now, not as a route of escape, but as a return under new terms. And with every mile, she could feel herself shifting, not regressing but reclaiming, her breath slow and even, her eyes clear, her shoulders back not in defense but in dignity. The old house came into view around midday, hunched and tired beneath a sky that had once looked like punishment, but now simply stretched pale and vast above it. The porch sagged more than she remembered, the paint peeled deeper, the windows dull and grayed with dust, but still it stood, and so did she. She paused at the gate, letting the wind roll over her, carrying with it faint memories, the slap of screen doors, the rustle of anger in a man's chest, the way she used to calculate. Every step between rooms like a soldier navigating a minefield. But now the calculations were gone. The field had already been crossed, and she wasn't here to relive. She was here to release. The house was empty. Of course her father had long since moved to a smaller shack on the other side of the valley. Nearer the church, nearer the silence he seemed to seek more and more, but the bones of the place were still thick with memory. She stepped onto the porch, its boards groaning, and waited for the familiar pang of fear to coil in her stomach. It didn't come. Instead, there was only an odd stillness, like returning to a town after war has passed through a sense that something sacred had once happened here, even if it was pain. She opened the door. The hinges cried in protest. The inside was dust and shadow, the air heavy with the smell of old smoke and dried wood. Everything was smaller than she remembered. The table where she once crouched under with her hands over her ears, the corner she once hid in during the longest nights, the windows that had once seemed like unreachable exits. She walked the rooms, slowly, touching nothing, only looking, as if cataloging a ghost. Her old bedroom still had the notch in the wall where she used to scratch tallies with a rusted nail, her only way of tracking time when days blurred into survival. She ran her finger across it now, gently, and whispered, "You made it, not to the room, but to the girl who once lived inside it." Then she stepped back outside. She circled behind the house, to the patch of earth beneath the gnarled tree, the place where, when she was small, she had once buried a broken doll her mother had given her, as if by pressing it into the soil, she could make her mother's memory grow again. It hadn't worked, but now, years later, she carried something else. From her satchel, she drew a small carving, the bird the man had given her months ago, the one with wings spread wide, and with careful hands, she dug into the soil, deep and firm, pressing it into the ground. Around it, she placed stones. Not to mark a grave, but a monument. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply knelt there, one hand in the dirt, the other resting on her knee, and breathed. It was not grief, she felt it was clarity. For the first time, she could look at the place of her pain without being devoured by it. She saw it all, what had been done to her, what she had endured, what she had learned despite it, and she could now hold those truths without flinching. They did not define her. They shaped her, yes, but they did not own her. The man who once ruled this place had lost that power the moment she stopped needing his permission to live fully. She stood again. The sun had shifted, shadows stretching long across the field. She turned to the house one last time, and in the silence between her heartbeats, she whispered not a farewell, but a benediction. "You don't hold me anymore." Then she walked away, not with haste, but with the calm certainty of someone who has completed something ancient and sacred. As she passed through the gate and onto the road that led back to the river, the wind stirred behind her, lifting dust and leaves, brushing gently at her back as if in approval. And in her chest, something loosened, something finally let go. She would return to that home by the water now, to the place where goats roamed and laughter floated like morning mist, to the hands that had never once demanded she be anything other than whole. She did not need to tell them what she had done. They would see it in the way she walked, in the way her eyes met theirs, steady and unashamed. The past had not vanished. It never would. But it no longer had teeth, no longer had the final word. That belonged to her now, and she had chosen, in this sacred returning, to speak peace. Back at the house by the river, life did not pause to welcome her return. There were no banners, no questions, no expectant eyes waiting to ask what she had seen or said or buried. Instead, there was a goat caught in the fence, a bucket tipped over by wind, a stew that needed stirring. And this, more than anything, was what made her chest loosen and her ribs feel less like a cage, because here, healing was not a ceremony, it was a continuation, an unbroken thread of belonging that didn't ask her to explain, just invited her back into motion. And as she stepped through the open gate, her boots dusted with soil from the old house, she exhaled into the simple familiarity of this place where love was shown in daily acts. Hands passing tools, a nod toward the coop, a slice of bread buttered with quiet attention. She did not speak of the burial, of the bird carving resting under that gnarled tree, and they did not ask. They only looked at her a little longer that night as they sat around the fire, her body silhouetted against the flames, and something passed between them, wordless, weightless, a kind of mutual understanding. She had gone, and she had returned. And in that journey, something had been made whole. The next morning, she rose earlier than usual. The river was still dark, mist curling off its skin like breath. As she sat beside it, knees drawn up, listening to the world waking around her, noticing, with a kind of reverence, the ordinary symphony of her new life, the wings of birds slicing, the air above the trees, the distant bray of the neighbor's mule, the click of the woman's wooden spoon against the pot inside. She no longer hovered at the edges of these sounds. She moved within them, her presence no longer an intrusion, but a rhythm of its own. She took to planting that spring first in the shallow beds behind the coop, then expanding outward, turning over earth with her hands until her palms bore calluses and her nails held moons of soil. And in that patient labor, she discovered a kind of grace that the past had never allowed her, to grow something not because she was told to, but because she chose to. Carrots, beans, squash, each seed placed with intention, each row lined with stones she carried from the river herself. She named the rows quietly, to herself after things she'd once longed for: hope, mercy, stillness. One she called forgiveness, not for her father, but for herself, for the years she had spent believing she was unlovable, unforgivable, a burden built from bruises. The earth, for its part, did not ask for explanations. It received her offerings. Without judgment, gave back sprouts, then leaves, then bloom. The man noticed. One evening, as she was hauling water, he touched her shoulder, not heavy, just a pause of hand, and said, "You're good with the land." It was the highest compliment he ever gave, and she carried it like a banner. The woman began teaching her the older ways, then not out of obligation, but because she sensed the readiness: how to dry corn with ash, how to preserve meat with juniper, how to weave rope from dogbane stalks. These lessons were not merely skills, they were inheritances, passed with care, and each time the woman placed a tool in her hands, it felt not like instruction, but invitation. They began to call her by her full name now, not just the short version she had clung to in childhood. And though she had once hated its weight, its association with her past, she now wore it differently, the way you might wear an old coat, with a new lining, something reclaimed and made useful again. With time, she claimed other things as well: the little stool by the window where she read each dusk, the woven basket she repaired and made her own, the wooden box under the bed where she kept feathers, stones, tiny mementos that meant nothing to the world, but everything to her. She began writing, too, not stories, not letters, but thoughts. Observations, a memory here, a phrase there. Some days just a single word: still, trust, stay. She didn't share them, not yet. But the act of putting them to paper felt like planting seeds in her own mind, like offering a map to herself in case she ever got lost again. The man gave her a blade that summer, a small one, handle smoothed from years of use, and simply said, "For carving." She held it with reverence, not as a weapon, but as a tool of creation. Her first carving was crude, a hawk with wings too short, beak too long, but it stood. Her second was better. By the fifth, the shapes began to resemble flight. She lined them along her windowsill, birds in different stages of ascent, and in their shadowy company, she began to understand something she hadn't dared to before. She was building a life, not surviving one. And it was hers, entirely. She took to teaching the goats her name, laughing softly when they responded with indifference. And once, when one gave birth, she stayed up through the night with the doe, whispering stories to it. In the darkness, stories she had never told anyone: of the doll she buried, of the teacher who looked away, of the first time she held a piece of honeycomb and tasted kindness. The kid was born at dawn, legs wobbly, coat slick, and she named it Light. By midsummer, she had started weaving again, not out of necessity, but out of joy. Patterns she saw in her dreams, colors she felt when she heard the river. The woman watched her once and said, "Your hands remember softness now." It struck her deep, that sentence, because it was true. Her body, once shaped entirely by bracing and flinching, now moved with ease. Her laughter came without apology. Her eyes stayed open, even when people raised their voices. The past had not been erased, but it had been contextualized, folded into something larger, something durable. Resilience, she realized, was not always forged in fire. Sometimes it was grown in shade, nurtured in silence, watered by small acts of care until it bloomed quietly, almost invisibly, in the hidden corners of ordinary life, and she was that bloom, not loud, not sudden, but strong, real, rooted. She no longer needed to be seen to know she existed. She knew herself in the taste of bread she had baked with her own hands, in the scratches on her palms from gathering firewood, in the soft ache of her shoulders after a day in the field. She knew herself in the way the goats gathered around her, in the way the man left tools out trusting she would know what to do, in the way the woman began asking her what she thought before making decisions. She belonged now not as a guest, not as a charity, but as family. And though the word had once been poisoned, now it tasted sweet. She carried her roots not in her name, but in her choices. And those choices, made quietly and daily, had transformed her. She had not just survived the storm, she had become the shelter. And now, when she stood by the river at dusk and saw her reflection in the water, she did not see a girl broken by the past. She saw a young woman defined by what she had, planted by what she had chosen to grow. And in that image, in that quiet moment, she saw the truth she had been living toward all along. She was free. It began the way most sacred things do, not with declaration or design, but with a whisper, a moment so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, the kind of moment that settles into the folds of time and blooms only in hindsight. And for her, it came one evening as she sat beside the youngest goat, light, its breath soft against her forearm, her hand resting absent-mindedly on its back as the sun dropped behind the far ridge, casting the river in gold, and the boy, a visitor from the next farm over, no more than 7 or 8, with dirt on his chin and questions always pooling in his eyes, asked her, "Were you scared when you came here?" And she paused, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she didn't expect to be asked. And the silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was full, rich, waiting. And then she said the first sentence aloud, "Yes, I was afraid of everything." And with those words, spoken like a slow breath after years underwater, her voice returned, not as something foreign, not as something borrowed, but as something wholly her own, a quiet tool she had once buried for safety, and now unearthed with reverence. The boy nodded, as though he already knew, and sat beside her in the grass. And so she spoke again, not much, just fragments, a memory of the bird carving, the feeling of the first warm bread placed in her hand, the moment she looked her father in the eyes and saw not a monster, but a man too full of his own ruin to hold anything else. And she didn't explain the whole story, didn't offer the sharpest parts, but what she gave was real. And the boy listened, not with pity, but with that sacred attention only children possess. And when she finished, he said, "I get scared too." And just like that, something holy passed between them. Her pain, reshaped by honesty, became a bridge. After that, she spoke more, not often, not loudly, but enough. Enough for the woman to notice the way her voice carried now across the room, soft and certain. Enough for the man to nod when she corrected him on a knot, enough for the neighbors, children to gather near her when she sat beneath the willow with a spool of twine in her lap. And so the stories grew, not as performance, but as inheritance, small truths offered like seed in the palm, scattered gently into the lives of those around her. She didn't call them stories, not yet. She called them remembering. "I remember," she would say, "when I used to think silence was safer," or "I remember the sound of the wind the night I decided not to be afraid anymore." And in these moments, those listening didn't just hear, they felt seen. Especially the girls, the quiet ones, the ones who flinched too easily, laughed too late. They watched her, and in her posture upright, grounded, they saw what was possible, not erasure of pain, but transformation. The woman encouraged it, in her own way, leaving a journal open beside the hearth one morning, its pages blank except for the first line, "Your story matters." She didn't say who it was for, But the girl, now not so much a girl as a young woman, took it, and that night, by candlelight, began to write. Not chronologically, not neatly. Just moments, impressions, the heat of a slap, the softness of goat fur, the weight of forgiveness pressed into the soil. Some pages were messy, crossed out, unfinished. Others were full of color, metaphor, songs she half remembered from her mother's lips. Over time, the journal filled not just with memory, but with meaning. And the more she wrote, the more she realized she had never truly been voiceless, only unheard. Her voice had lived in her, waiting for safety, for stillness, for time. And now, with all three gathered around her like kind elders, she spoke. She spoke when neighbors asked about the river's rise, when younger girls asked how to thread a needle, when the old man at the mill offered her a ride and she said, without flinching, "No, thank you, I'll walk," and meant it. And then one day, the woman asked her if she would like to share her remembering with others. "Not everyone," she said, "just the ones who need it." And so it was arranged. Once a month at dusk, the fire would be lit outside near the cottonwoods, benches set in a circle, cups of tea passed around, and those who needed a place to breathe would come quietly, without names, without expectation. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just listened to the crackle of the fire and the rustle of wind and the occasional rusted creak of the barn. But always, at some point, she would speak, not rehearsed, not performed, just offered. A memory, a lesson, a truth. And each time, a piece of her past laid down gently in the circle, not as a burden, but as a seed. There were tears, yes, but there was also laughter, deep, surprising laughter that bubbled up when someone told a story about hiding in the pantry from their drunk uncle, or how their first attempt at baking was so bad even the goats refused. In these shared moments, healing happened not as a cure, but as a communion. Her voice, once a hostage of trauma, had become a thread. And with it, she began to stitch people together. One evening, after a particularly quiet gathering, a woman lingered. She was older, with tired hands and a downturned mouth, and she said only this, "I didn't think anyone else had felt that afraid and lived to tell it." And the girl, now fully a woman in presence if not yet in age, took her hand and said, "We live not just to tell it, but to make sure others do too." That became her quiet purpose, not a mission, not a role, just a way of being. To live in such a way that others could live more fully too. And it changed her, not quickly, not obviously, but deeply. Her posture softened, her eyes warmed. Her silences became sacred, not shameful. She stopped waiting for the past to disappear and started inviting the present to stay. And in doing so, she became more than a survivor. She became a storyteller, a keeper of light, a whisperer of hope. And though the wind still carried the sound of sorrow sometimes, she no longer braced against it. She let it pass through her, knowing she was no longer hollow, no longer breakable. She had been filled by story, by song, by the simple act of being heard, and now she made sure others were too. Legacy, she came to understand, is not what you leave behind when you're gone, but what you build each day with your hands, your choices, and your voice when you think no one is listening. And for her, the legacy that had once seemed like a shackle one forged from bruises and broken silences was now something else entirely, a garden, a room with open doors, a way of walking that left gentleness in its wake. And it started small, as most legacies do, with the girls who came to her quietly after the fire gatherings, eyes down, fingers twisting hems, voices thin with the ache of recognition, and they didn't always speak clearly, didn't always name what had happened to them, but they didn't need to. She saw it in their flinch, in their hesitation to sit too close to the men, in the way their laughter came slow, like something recently unburied. And for each of them, she offered not solutions but space, a task to do, a story to hear, A moment to stand barefoot in the river and remember what it felt like to be a child before fear took root. She didn't think of herself as a healer. That was too big a word, too heavy with expectations. But she knew how to notice, and she knew how to stay. And so she became something simpler and far more powerful, a steady presence. A woman who did not turn away. A woman who had once been broken and now bore the blueprint of mending. One girl, Clara, only 13, arrived on the back of an old wagon one fall evening, her uncle's rough voice saying she needed some time away from home. And though he never explained, the way the girl stood, arms crossed tightly over her chest, jaw set like stone, told everything. The woman welcomed her in, offered tea, then a stool, then silence, and over weeks, the girl unfolded, not all at once, but like a leaf after frost. A smile first, then a question about the goats, then a single whispered sentence late one night. "Sometimes I dream of running forever," to which the woman replied, "You don't have to run to be free." There were others. A boy with anger coiled so tightly in his fists he could barely hold a spoon. A mother with bruises shaped like rings. A grandmother who had kept her story locked behind her teeth for 70 years until, in the fire's glow, she said, "I see myself in you." And every time, the woman listened, not with the ears of someone waiting to respond, but with the heart of someone who had once begged to be believed. She began teaching, not formally, but with intention, how to sew not just seams but patience into every stitch, how to tend a garden like a life, prune the dead, water the weak, protect what blooms. She showed them how to start fires that warmed and didn't consume, how to write truths on paper, even if you burned them afterward. And little by little, those who came to her began to grow. Some stayed, some moved on. But all left traces, drawings pinned to the barn wall, songs hummed at dusk, letters folded into the pockets of coats. The house became more than a refuge. It became a place of initiation, not into pain, but into peace. Into the daily, deliberate act of choosing softness over armor. The man and woman who had once taken her in watched with quiet awe as she became not just their daughter in spirit, but their mirror reflecting back the kind of love they had always hoped to plant. The man, now gray at the temples, began to defer to her in matters of harvest and timber, nodding as she spoke, stepping back so she could lead. The woman gave her the ledger book one afternoon, saying only, "It's yours now. You know what we value." And in that passing of pages, that unspoken trust, she felt something anchored deeper than blood, something sacred and earned. She began to write letters then to those who had never come but needed to hear, to the teacher who looked away, to the woman at the market who once placed an apple in her hand with trembling pity. She didn't send them. They weren't for the world. They were for her, to rewrite her own legacy, not in reaction to pain, but in response to love. One letter, though, she did deliver. To her father. It was short, 3 sentences. "I am safe. I am well. I hope you have found a way to rest." She left it at the chapel steps, not knowing if he'd find it, not needing to. Forgiveness, she'd come to understand, wasn't about making things even. It was about freeing herself from the weight of holding on. And she had let go, fully. The past no longer clung. It echoed sometimes, yes, in dreams or sudden winds, but it no longer dictated her direction. Her compass was different now, set by joy, by purpose, by the quiet exhilaration of seeing a once silent girl smile without fear. And perhaps that was her legacy, most of all not the story of what was done to her, but the life she built anyway. Not a monument to suffering, but a pathway through it. She began to carve birds again, each one unique, each one gifted to someone who had taken a step toward freedom. And in time, people began to speak of her, not as the girl who was beaten, but as the woman who listened, the woman who gave birds to the broken, who taught stillness like a song. Children born in the valley would come to know her name not from gossip, but from their mothers, who told them, "She will help you if you're lost." And she would. Every time, not because it was owed, but because it was needed. Her legacy was not a burden, it was a bridge. And she crossed it daily, barefoot and unafraid.